At 82, I had stopped expecting surprises. Life had settled into a slow rhythm of mornings with tea, afternoons tending to the roses my husband once loved, and evenings spent watching the sun disappear behind the maple trees outside our little farmhouse. For 3 years, I had lived alone after saying goodbye to the man who had shared 60 years of my life. His name was Thomas. People often asked whether the loneliness became easier with time. I always smiled politely and said yes. The truth was that grief never leaves. It simply changes clothes. Some days it sits quietly beside you. Other days it reaches into the smallest memories and reminds you of everything you've lost. That morning, I wasn't searching for memories. I was looking for an old tax document. The attic had become a museum of forgotten years. Dust floated through beams of sunlight as I climbed the narrow wooden steps, carrying a small flashlight despite the daylight. Every box held another chapter of our lives. Our children's school drawings, faded Christmas decorations, camping equipment we hadn't touched in decades. Near the back wall sat an old cedar chest. Thomas had always kept it locked. After he passed, I found the key taped underneath one of his workbenches, but I had never gathered the courage to open it. Somehow it felt like crossing into a place meant only for him. 3 years had passed. Maybe it was finally time. The lock clicked open with surprising ease. Inside were neatly folded military photographs, letters from his parents, newspaper clippings, and dozens of birthday cards I had written to him over 6 decades. Every card had been saved. I smiled through tears. Typical Thomas. He never threw anything away if it came from someone he loved. At the very bottom lay a single cream-coloured envelope. Across the front, written in his unmistakable handwriting, were 7 simple words. For Eleanor, open only when you're ready, not after my death, not on a certain date, only when you're ready. My hands trembled. It felt as though he was sitting beside me, patiently waiting while I decided. I stared at the envelope for several minutes. Finally, I slipped my finger beneath the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the ink remained dark and clear. My dearest Ellie, if you're reading this, then you've decided the time has come. Knowing you, you've probably waited much longer than I expected. You always believed every drawer should stay exactly as I left it. A laugh escaped before tears followed. He knew me too well. I've carried one secret throughout our marriage. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I promised someone I would wait until the right time. I stopped reading. A secret? In 60 years together, Thomas had never lied to me. Or had he? I continued. The truth isn't about another family. It isn't about another woman. It isn't about money hidden under the floorboards. I know that's where your imagination is probably going. Despite myself, I laughed again. He had anticipated every fear. The secret is about a promise I made when I was 21 years old. 21, that was before we met. Long before our wedding, before children, before everything. I leaned against the attic wall and continued reading. During the winter of 1965, I worked nights at the train station. One evening, an elderly man collapsed on the platform. Everyone rushed past because they were afraid of missing the last train. I stayed. I could picture it. Thomas had always been that kind of man. He would stop to help a stranger even if it made him late. The man survived. Before leaving the hospital, he handed me a sealed envelope and asked me to guard it until the day I believed someone truly needed hope more than answers. I frowned. Hope more than answers. What did that even mean? He never told me his full story, only that the envelope had once saved his own life. I looked around the silent attic. Was that envelope here? Had Thomas kept it all these years? My heart beat faster. The letter continued. I made him a promise. Every year I considered opening it. Every year I remembered my words. Then came a sentence that made my breath catch. After I met you, I knew why I had been chosen. I whispered his name. Thomas. You taught me that the greatest treasures aren't discovered. They're protected until someone else needs them. There was another folded note tucked behind the firsts. Smaller, heavier paper. On the outside were the words, "The second envelope is hidden where every spring begins." No explanation, no map, nothing else. I searched through the cedar chest. Nothing. Every photograph, every document, every letter. The mysterious second envelope wasn't there. I sat frozen for nearly an hour. Where every spring begins. What could that possibly mean? Then I remembered. The old stone well behind our house. Every spring, Thomas would inspect the water pump before planting season. He always called it Where Spring Begins. I hurried downstairs faster than an 82-year-old woman had any business moving. The afternoon air smelled of fresh grass. The well stood exactly where it always had, surrounded by wildflowers and memories. I examined every stone, nothing. Then I noticed something unusual. One loose brick near the back. Thomas had repaired that wall himself nearly 20 years earlier. My fingers slipped behind the stone. There it was. Another envelope, dry, perfectly preserved inside a small metal container. This one wasn't addressed to me. Across the front, in handwriting I had never seen before, were the words, "To the next keeper of hope." I hesitated. Technically it wasn't mine, yet Thomas had clearly intended for me to find it. Inside was a single page, no signature, no date, just a story. It began with these words. If you are reading this, then someone believed your heart was still capable of changing the world. I read every line twice. The anonymous writer described losing everything during a terrible winter. His family, his home, his purpose. One stranger had shown him unexpected kindness by sharing half a loaf of bread and refusing payment. That single act convinced him life was still worth living. Years later, after rebuilding his life, he decided to create a tradition. Instead of leaving money to strangers, he would leave hopes. He wrote letters reminding ordinary people that one act of kindness can echo across generations in ways they never witness. At the bottom was a challenge. When you have found someone who has forgotten their own value, tell them your story. Then ask them to continue this chain. I stared across our backyard. Was that all? No hidden fortune, no shocking confession, just hope? For a brief moment I almost felt disappointed. Then I noticed another piece of paper folded beneath it. This one was unmistakably Thomas's handwriting. If you're disappointed, keep reading. I smiled despite myself. Even now he could read my thoughts. I know you expected a dramatic secret, but here's the truth I've hidden for 60 years. My hands tightened around the page. The envelope was never the real secret. The envelope was never the real secret. You were, not because you didn't know it, but because you never believed it. When we first met, you thought you were ordinary. You apologized for everything. You believed you had nothing special to offer anyone. Even after we married, you kept saying, "I'm just a simple woman." You were wrong. I have watched you quietly change lives for 60 years. You made soup for neighbours who were too proud to ask for help. You babysat children whose parents were working double shifts. You stayed awake with frightened relatives in hospital waiting rooms. You remembered birthdays everyone else forgot. You sent anonymous Christmas gifts to families who were struggling. You listened more than you spoke. You forgave more than most people ever could. And somehow you convinced yourself none of it mattered, because nobody applauded. Ellie, goodness rarely makes headlines. It changes hearts instead. Tears blurred every word. How many times had I dismissed those little moments as insignificant? To me, they had simply been the right thing to do. Nothing extraordinary. Thomas apparently disagreed. I never told you because I feared you would stop doing those things if you believed they made you remarkable. You always preferred being invisible. But now, after I'm gone, I need you to know what I saw. The next paragraph shook me more than anything else. I kept a journal. A journal? There are names inside. Hundreds of them. People whose lives crossed yours. People who asked about you years later. People who never forgot your kindness. My heart raced. Hundreds? Surely he was exaggerating. At the bottom of the page, he had written one final instruction. The journal is in my workshop. Lift the loose floorboard beneath the old workbench. I folded the letters carefully and walked toward the workshop. That building had hardly changed since Thomas built it 45 years earlier. His tools still hung exactly where he had left them. The scent of cedar and machine oil lingered in the air. For 3 years I had entered only to dust, never to search. The old workbench stood in the corner. I knelt slowly, my knees protesting every movement. The third floorboard from the left shifted just enough to lift free. Beneath it rested a worn leather notebook tied with blue ribbons. I untied it carefully. The first page read, "Things Ellie Never Knew." I laughed softly through fresh tears. Only Thomas would choose such a title. Each page contained a date, a place, a person's name, and a short note. April 14, 1972. You spent 2 hours talking to a frightened young mother in the grocery parking lot after her husband left. Today she owns the bakery downtown. She says your words kept her alive. I frowned. I barely remembered that afternoon. Next page, September 8, 1981. You knitted a blanket for a premature baby. 23 years later, that child became a pediatric nurse. Another page. December 19, 1987. You secretly paid the heating bill for the Wilson family. They never learned it was you. Another. March 3, 1995. You encouraged a shy teenage girl to apply for college. She became the first doctor in her family. Page after page, memory after memory. Most of them I had completely forgotten. Thomas hadn't. He had quietly documented them for decades, not to praise me, to remind me one day. Near the centre of the journal was an envelope taped inside. This one carried my name again. I opened it carefully. My loves, if you've reached this page, you've probably spent the last hour insisting these stories aren't important. You always underestimate yourself. So let me tell you something you don't know. I smiled. There it was again. Another secret. Every anniversary, instead of buying expensive gifts, I spent the day visiting people whose lives you had touched. I stared in disbelief. What? I wanted to know what happened after your kindness. You never asked because you weren't helping people to receive credit. But I wanted you to have the answers someday. The room suddenly felt very still. Thomas had spent 60 anniversaries following the echoes of my kindness. One anniversary he visited a retired school teacher. Another year he tracked down a family we had once helped after a house fire. Another time he drove 3 states away to meet a man who had nearly taken his own life before one conversation with me convinced him to seek help. Each visit ended the same way. He asked them one question. If you could say one thing to Ellie today, what would it be? He had written every answer. She reminded me I mattered. She treated me like family. She believed in me before I believed in myself. She gave me hope. She never judged me. She saved my marriage. She changed my future. I wish she knew. My hand shook so hard I had to close the journal. For 82 years, I had measured my life by what I hadn't accomplished. I never became wealthy, never wrote a book, never travelled the world, never won awards. Yet here was proof that an ordinary life had reached farther than I ever imagined. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the workshop windows. Thomas had once loved rainy afternoons. He used to say they slowed the world enough for people to hear their own hearts. I sat there for a long time listening. Near the back of the journal something slipped onto the floor. A photograph. I picked it up. It showed a little girl standing beside me at a church picnic nearly 30 years earlier. I remembered her, barely. Her name had been Lily. She hardly spoke. She clung to my hand all afternoon while the adults talked. On the back of the photo, Thomas had written, "She comes every Mother's Day." What did that mean? Every Mother's Day? I turned another page. There was an address and beneath it only one sentence. She still asks about you. The address was only 40 minutes away. I looked at the clock. It was barely 3 in the afternoon. Without giving myself time to overthink, I grabbed my purse, placed the journal carefully inside, and started the car. The drive felt strangely familiar, though I couldn't remember ever visiting that neighborhood. The address led me to a small white house with blue shutters. Flowers lined the front porch. A wind chime sang softly in the breeze. For several minutes I simply sat behind the steering wheel. What if I had the wrong person? What if she didn't remember me? Finally, I gathered my courage and knocked. Footsteps approached. The door opened. A woman in her 40s looked at me. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. Then her eyes filled with tears. She whispered only 2 words. "Mrs. Carter?" I nodded slowly. Before I could say anything, she wrapped her arms around me. "I've waited 28 years to thank you.